Analytics should be used in place to support and solidify what scouts are saying, what coaches are seeing. It should be evidence that's usable by coaches to help measure performance and evaluate. Numbers are your friend, and I think what you're seeing a lot now in sports is the people that are really against them are the ones that are falling by the wayside.
Sports science, strength and conditioning, high performance coaching. Welcome to the Decoding Excellence Show. Today's episode is brought to you by Vald Performance, the makers of the NordBord. If you haven't checked out their website yet, I highly suggest you head over there, whether it's return to play, injury prevention, or just plain performance testing. Vald Performance has the tools that you need. Check them out at valdperformance.com. Today on the Decoding Excellence Show, I have guest Dr. Mike Sonne on to discuss analytics, pitching mechanics, muscular fatigue, and the importance of truly understanding the implications for rule changes in MLB. This is a wide-ranging conversation that discusses monitoring strategies, muscular fatigue, and performance technologies. If you are interested in using technology and information to impact your athlete's well-being, then this is a show that you cannot miss. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Mike Sonne. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam.
Hey, thanks for so much for agreeing to come on and talk a little bit with us. I find your materials and everything that you've been sharing on social media riveting, and again, the whole nature of this show for me is to sort of scratch my own itch and to have an opportunity to reach out to people like yourself, people that are involved in research, involved in their professional pursuit and whatever discipline that they might be in, and having an opportunity to pick your brain and get to know you a little bit more on a personal level, and to get to understand what makes you tick, what makes you you. And I'm just excited that you had the availability and we've finally been able to connect. How's everything going for you today?
Things are going well. It's a beautiful blue sky here up in Hamilton. Pretty cold today, but it's a beautiful winter day. Oh,
perfect! Right. It's deceiving out here. So even though it's like early March for us in Kansas, it's been the least amount of winter than we've ever had before. So, it's shorts and t-shirts in the middle of February. So for me, I can't complain as a northern, coming from Michigan. I'm used to, packing up in a parka and moving around and having 7 scarves on. So it's a welcomed, and certainly I've been down here for a little bit, but it's a welcome change to get away from the snowy, wintry mix that usually seems to linger around forever, man. But I wanted to get you on today because I think you've been sharing some great materials, and I wanted to get to know you a little bit more and talk about maybe what your specialty is, and I'll let you kind of dive in a little bit deeper to that as well. But I wanted for you, or wanted to hear from you, maybe like an updated bio. Like, what are you currently up to in your day-to-day in, what you might consider your 9 to 5? And then what are you doing in the evenings? Like, what is your, what's the latest going on in your life?
Yeah, so the passions and the occupations Venn diagram is starting to bleed together a lot more than it was maybe 6 months ago. But I work at an organization in Ontario called the Occupational Health Clinic for Ontario Workers, and I'm an ergonomist there. So my role there is to be a resource to anyone in the province of Ontario who wants to know more about occupational injury or how to keep themselves healthy and safe in the workplace, and primarily through the discipline of ergonomics, which is the study of how people work. So my day job is ergonomics, primarily for our grand workforce here. But what's been bleeding into the night is applying all those lessons I've learned in ergonomics for injury prevention, and applying those to my favorite pastime of baseball. So trying to understand, how pitchers perform, how hitters perform, and how we can apply what we've learned in this totally, somebody would say a totally opposite field, but trying to learn some of those lessons and bring them forward to baseball.
Man, that's fascinating. That it lends me to what is my next question, which is, how did you get interested? What was the story behind maybe your passion, if you can recall back to childhood memories or adolescent memories? Why baseball? What is it that first sort of excites you about that sport? And then we'll maybe dive into the injury prevention piece second.
So my family, we've always joked that we're terrible Canadians because every birthday I had growing up as a kid just outside of Toronto, it was going to Blue Jays games and playing Little League there. My sister played softball growing up. My dad played slow pitch. My mom was my baseball coach. We were just huge baseball junkies, and then football was a ways down in second, and then hockey was somewhere off in the distant third. So we sometimes get threatened to take our passports away, but we were just always a huge baseball family. And the last few years with the Blue Jays making the playoffs again, it's brought back a lot of those great memories of being in grade 2, grade 3, and watching the Jays win the World Series. So yeah, the baseball has always been a huge part of my life. There was a long period where I didn't do anything related to playing after high school, and then during my doctoral studies and my postdoc, I started getting into some of the databases, the PitchFX databases, and applying just some of the things I knew about statistics and research methods and ergonomics, and bringing it all together. So it's my passions and my professions, and we're bringing them all together and having a lot of fun with it.
And I think that's like where the magic happens, when you can start to piece together both what is your professional means of income and what you're doing to support your lifestyle and your life and your family and everything else, and then the passion, right? And that seems to be baseball at this point, and this injury prevention piece. And as I look through and certainly having conversations with other professionals in the industries, it seems like you're in a good spot with the Blue Jays as well, just in close proximity, because they also have a huge injury prevention and certainly emphasis, as most professional organizations do, on pitching mechanics and using technology and using objectifiable information to make real-time live decisions. So I'd love for you to maybe talk a little bit more, if you would, about what your doctoral studies were in, and maybe, if you feel motivated, compelled to kind of dive deep and talk a little bit more at detail about it. This is sort of my first exposure was reading some of your work and going through that, and I'd love for you to share that with the audience of a large deal here.
Yeah, so our lab at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, we had a grant with the automotive industry. And our grant was to better understand ergonomics job simulations using digital human models. So to break that down, it's essentially using the same machines and equipment that EA Sports used to do predictions of assembly line work and see if jobs are acceptable and keep workers safe. So my little piece of that puzzle was to better understand how muscle fatigue works. And we were first and foremost a biomechanics lab. But when you study ergonomics, biomechanics is just a small piece of that puzzle. So my PhD thesis actually involved some traditional biomechanics work looking at force production, but then I had a study in there that was a lot more neurophysiology based, so looking at muscle stimulation and twitch responses during fatigue, and then even some psychophysics in there. So relying on people's perceptions to see how much force they deem to be acceptable. And then we got some mathematical modeling in at the end, because you always have to have that that type of nerdy stuff when you're in biomechanics. But the really fun thing about ergonomics is that you're limited to your imagination when it comes to tools to study the field. So we have people who are trained cognitive ergonomists who have a psychology background. We've got mechanical engineers, industrial engineers, kinesiologists, physiologists, really across the entire board. And we're all trying to get together at the end and understand, how do injuries happen? How do we keep people more productive? Have higher quality work, and have people go home at the end of the day and be able to do their hobbies and spend time with their families. So yeah, it's the overall crux of it was, how can we predict fatigue in complex tasks? And the initial focus of that was, how do we predict fatigue in one of the big three auto manufacturers' assembly lines, where people are moving tires, using wrenches, they're doing all these different things together. How much fatigue would they incur? And then in the postdoc world, what I ended up doing was applying that to baseball, and we had one paper published in Journal of Sports Sciences that looked at the influence of the possible pitch clock rule on predicted muscle fatigue, and that was kind of my launching point into the baseball world.
That's fascinating. And if you, for the audience, certainly if you haven't checked out your blog, it's Mike Sonne, SONNE.ca. If you're fascinated about everything science and baseball, but I'd love for you to also, when you think about the blend between what you do professionally and this passion of baseball, maybe it's intuitive, maybe it comes from, just the nature of having, the two disciplines. But what do you think was the genesis? What do you think the reason was that you started to gravitate to pitching or mechanics and that muscular fatigue and injury rates? Like, how did that come to be in your world?
Honestly, it was kind of just this might be a fun thing to do, and over a couple scotches with some friends, we talked about the idea, and it was relatively easy to get something put into the fatigue model and give us some results that were relatively interesting. So like most of the ideas that I've had in the research world, it tends to just come from having general conversations with friends, and then all of a sudden you have a research idea. Kind of blending the professional and the hobbies. The one thing, like I was saying, the Venn diagram's kind of closing, because the way that I give general ergonomics presentations now to, I was down talking to my brothers and sisters with the United Steelworkers Union in Pittsburgh last September, and there's some people in the room that are like, oh, my job, there's no way ergonomics can be applied to this. So I'm here because it's part of the schedule and I have to be.
Yeah.
But what I do is I start off the presentation and I say, okay, here's a workplace where workers are working a really high effort job. Their cycle repeats up to 120 times per shift. And now their management is trying to take away some of their rest break during their shift. And, that's a risk because it's going to cause them more fatigue. Do you have any idea what industry this is? And people come in, they say, oh, it's nursing. Oh, it's an assembly line. Oh, it's an office worker. It's this and that. And then I put up the slide and say, no, this is actually an example of applying ergonomics to the baseball world. And after that, everybody's pretty interested, and they kind of say, okay, you know what? I can see maybe there's a role for this in my workplace.
Yeah. And I think I wonder too, with just how data heavy the baseball world is. I mean, between like sabermetrics and the fact that literally everything is predictable in some respects to baseball, and it relies so much on numbers, at least historically, if that might have lent itself to being one of the first sort of sports that really had such a data emphasis. And I'm trying to think of other sports that might have preceded America's pastime that relied so much on numbers and analytics. But if you were to put on your sort of Nostradamus sort of cap and sort of predict the future, I mean, do you see others? I mean, I think, but do you see other sports starting to have more and more of a analytical approach to sort of measuring this muscular fatigue?
Well, I mean, if you look at the Sloan Sports Conference that's going on right now,
Yeah.
it may not necessarily be fatigue that they're looking at, but there was one paper that looked at fatigue in like NASCAR or IndyCar drivers. So everybody wants, like, every sport's the same. They all want to know how to predict if they're going to win better. They want to know how they can predict if their players will stay healthy. So it's all the same. Baseball is unique in that it's the same event repeated over and over again with like a fixed number of possible outcomes. Unlike hockey or soccer, where it's a very dynamic and fluid game, and it'd be very difficult to predict what's going to happen on a given play. Baseball is unique in that respect because realistically everyone gets the same opportunities, and whether you're a really good pitcher or a really bad pitcher, we have data, and in a lot of cases we have the same amount of data, whether you had a good outing or a bad outing. So that's what makes baseball unique. So I don't think you'll ever get to a point where we have the same quality of data in every other sport, or the ease of analysis in every other sport. But you can see right now, there's NHL analytics. Every sport is really getting into this analytics realm. And I even remember watching a couple football games this year where they were showing player top speeds because they had accelerometers embedded in their shoulder pads, and you're looking at concussion risk factors from player speed and that. So it's an exciting world if you're a data scientist and a sports fan right now.
Yeah, I mean, looking at like the NFL and what they're doing with zebra technologies, and then you have technology companies with accelerometers and gyroscopes like Catapult Sports starting to bleed into every sort of sports, whether it's NBA or hockey. And the reason I mentioned Blue Jays is because I thought, at least I don't think this is proprietary information by any means. Hopefully not. I'm trying not to get a cease and desist letter. But
or just some black van show up in front of your house and then you disappear and they're never heard from again.
I'm gone, and my wife and kids don't know where I'm at. But I mean, I know they were working with some minor league organizations trying to develop a pitching algorithm to predict muscular fatigue through the use of a center mass GPS and accelerometer. So, and I believe Blue Jays was one of the pilot teams that were doing that.
Well, I know like that catapult system, Marcus Stroman, he tore his ACL 2 years ago, and that was like a huge thing for monitoring his central fatigue when he was doing his rehab. And I mean, there's a great article on the sportsnet.ca website by Shai Davidi that talks about the entire rehab process and how he worked with Nikki Huffman, the physiotherapist at the Blue Jays, or at Duke at the time, who she's now with the Blue Jays, but just how data driven his rehab process was. And I think that's what you're kind of seeing too now in not only rehab, but in some of the monitoring that they do of pitchers. Like, years ago it was 100 pitches because it was a nice round number, and 200 innings was a nice round number. But realistically, if they're not showing any signs of central or peripheral fatigue, then there's no sense in stopping pitchers. And then the opposite of that is if they are showing those signs and they haven't hit that inning limit, then that's the time to shut a pitcher down. Yeah,
no doubt. And Nikki's great, and the conversations I've had with her, at least on Twitter, has been. I always walk away from them and my mind is blown, and I'm thinking about like, what can we continue to do better here? And then, I think when you mentioned Sloan, I'm regretful that I didn't make it up to Boston, because with silver on silver this year. I heard that it only was it was like standing room only, and it was crowded, and it was amazing. I'm curious about, like obviously with sort of the fixed outcomes and the sort of already the historical analytical approach of baseball. I mean, we're starting to see the sports view as far as positional tracking and NBA. We already have accelerometry data with a number of sports. And when you look at certainly like football, and well, I say football, but I guess I really mean like American soccer, those organizations already rely so much on statistics. And I think when we look at sort of that Sloan conference and, how far out do you think that we really are from having a better understanding of both using statistics, using analytics, using numbers to sort of impact coaching decisions in sort of mainstream professional coaches' daily sort of decision-making abilities? Are we close? Are we far? And from in your sort of professional opinion.
It's an interesting thing. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine named Dan Hamilton, who he works in the basketball field doing some analytics. And what I was saying is that it's interesting because there may already be a lot of that stuff happening. But the big difference between, the ergonomics world and the sports world is generally all companies are working together in ergonomics to try and prevent injury, because it's not good for the economy to have injured workers. It's not good for the socioeconomic aspects of it are it's not good to have those injuries. So people work together, and my PhD grant was funded by an organization called US CAR, which is a conglomerate of the big three auto industry who work together on non-competitive issues. But in the sports world, everything is a competitive issue. So there's not a lot of open data. You see some, but then there's other things that are kept secret. Like we'll never have access to all the catapult data from every organization. We'll never have access to all the Motus sleeve data from every organization because those are proprietary things. And even something like that Kinetrack system where they're looking at capturing pitcher kinematics, that's really useful stuff for a team to have to try and get a competitive advantage. So there's a lot of issues that may be already being addressed, but we may not know how far along they are in towards being solved because they're proprietary. And there was a great article in that Sloan Sports Conference that Dan sent me that looked at just like the lack of transparency and the lack of open access algorithms and data that are in all these papers, especially in like the finalists. But realistically, a lot of those abstracts are, dynamic resumes for these authors who are looking to get jobs in sports. And then once they're snapped up by a team, that now becomes their competitive advantage to try and beat the next team and win a championship and put more fans in their stands and have more prestige. So the nature of sport in general, it's causing a lot of advances, which is wonderful. But then we kind of are in the dark a little bit at the real cutting edge of it because we just don't know exactly what is being done by all these different organizations.
Yeah. And I think, until there's a sort of an open source database for some of these, which will never happen, right, for sort of IP purposes, the ability to scrape data and then be able to get sort of enough data points to make some decisions and run it through, predictive algorithms, I think will be incredibly challenging and probably very limited just because of the professional nature and the competitiveness of this sort of professional market that they're in. And, obviously you start looking at, when it's equipped human subjects and they now you're dealing with player unions and player associations, which is it seems like a challenge right now that the NBA is certainly going through with trying to figure out wearables and where their stance is from both a player health, player wellness standpoint and also, from a contract negotiation standpoint. So I'd be curious with your background. you said something just a moment ago, and I thought for clarification purposes, just because again, this is a wide-ranging conversation and discussion with, hopefully borrowing from every discipline. But for those people that aren't familiar with the Motus sleeve, and I know I've referenced Catapult and other sort of technology companies, but from a professional standpoint, from a consumer standpoint, and sometimes at the opposite ends of the continuum, this sort of Motus sleeve is a economical sort of way of starting to get some workloads as far as from a pitcher's shoulders, and certainly it's made its way into the NFL, which I think was maybe not its intended purposes. But could you share a little bit, if you feel comfortable, and to talk a little bit about the Motus sleeve and how it's sort of infiltrated the pitching, the baseball world?
Yeah, I actually just had a really good conversation with Ben Hansen, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Motus. And they're a rapidly growing company. They started out as a motion capture kind of biomechanics company, and now they're getting into consumer products for baseball and football. And what it is a little accelerometer with a Bluetooth interface that links up with your cell phone, iPhones right now. And it gives you things like predicted UCL stress. It gives you, or ulnar collateral ligament stress, so that ligament that can rupture and require a pitcher to get Tommy John surgery. It looks at your arm slot, your shoulder rotation, angle, all these different things that, at one point in time you needed to have a $500,000 motion capture lab to get even close to these data. Now it's available for like $200, and you create like a team account, and all your different players can feed into it. And as a coach, you can say, okay, this person's got a large workload. We should maybe back off of them, or this person has a little more room to work a bit harder today. And they recently put out an abstract that showed predicted UCL stress from this Motus sleeve was really comparable to a more expensive lab, which is super exciting. And as long as these data are reliable, I mean, this is the infancy of some of this workload monitoring, and it's going to just keep getting better. But you're so much further along now by having access to something like this than we were 10 years ago, when people were kind of just guessing at workloads.
Yeah. And I think this is that point where the intersection between technology and sport performance is relying on this ability of capturing what was otherwise very subjective information. Like, hey, it looks like, the pitch velocity is down. Maybe they're a little fatigued, or, they're off their mark. Okay, let's pull them out. And now we're starting to get some objectable sort of real information to actually make some decisions from it. To pair that with maybe another line of questioning, I'd be curious to hear, because obviously this has made its way into baseball and your background with baseball, and the blend of technology and everything. But so I want to dive down into some of your blog, because I'll put it out there, Mike Sonne, SONNE.ca. With the MLB announcing at least the idea, or playing with the idea, I think I was listening to the Jim Rome show last week or 2 weeks ago perhaps, and they were talking about the proposed at least pitch clock to try to speed up the pace of the MLB game, and why where the MLB and baseball is losing potentially a younger fan base, and they're sort of proposing that the game drags on. I think this would be a great segue into one of your latest blog pieces about pitch clocks and its relation on muscular fatigue and injury prevention, or injury sort of causing mechanisms. But if you want to go ahead and take the baton on that, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, and I'll let you run with it for a little bit.
So there was a really good paper by Dr. Bruce and Dr. Andrews that just looked at some of the different risk factors related to injuries in pitchers. And one of the things they came up with was fatigue. And when I say fatigue, I don't mean okay, so taking one step back, there's two types of fatigue we typically study. There's central fatigue, which is an inefficiency of your heart to pump blood and deliver oxygen to your tissues. And then there's peripheral fatigue, which is like a failure of the muscle to do a contraction and generate a force. And they kind of play off each other. But muscle fatigue is the one that we're concerned about when exposing the ulnar collateral ligament to more stress. So when somebody throws, we know that stress level is more than enough to rupture that ligament. So there's clearly something happening that the body is using to protect the ligament during throwing. And what that typically is you have a group of muscles in your forearm. I'm just realizing this is an audio podcast and I'm sitting here in my office gesturing to myself and touching my arm. But there's a group of muscles in your forearm called the flexor pronator mass. Those contract and they take the stress off the ligament in your elbow. So if those muscles can't generate as much force because they're fatigued, now that stress is going to get transmitted into the ligament. And as a result, that's where we see injury happening. So it makes total sense from a scientific standpoint why fatigue would be a concern here. And velocities are going up, which has been tied to having higher UCL stresses. We know that Tommy John surgeries are becoming more and more prevalent for more and more pitchers at younger ages, and they're all kind of tied together. So with the pitch clock thing, what I did was just kind of modeled what predicted fatigue would be for different pitchers if they were enforced to have that 20-second pitch clock versus their self-selected pace, which I got from some of that open data, the MLB game day data. And in this one example that I have with a David Price start, if you implemented the pitch clock, he'd have an 18% increase in the amount of fatigue in his forearm muscles and only an 8.3% decrease in time of the game. So you're essentially talking about shaving a couple minutes off the game. And in all honesty, if you're seeing a good, well-pitched, well-performed baseball game where there's lots of hits and lots of action, do you really care about that extra 3 minutes at the end of the day? So really the point that I'm trying to make with this pitch clock argument is that if we know one of the guaranteed risk factors for increasing the risk of Tommy John surgery in pitchers is fatigue, and there's now 2 scientific papers out there that have shown that pitch clocks are going to increase fatigue, and there's a group out of, I believe, Taiwan that studied a more physiological approach to how much fatigue a pitcher would have, even on the consecutive days in a pitch clock environment. And they showed this carried over by like 3 days. Like, this is a known risk factor, putting in that constraint of saying somebody has to pitch in a given time and not when they're ready. So why are you going down this road when you have an injury epidemic and at the same time you are willingly going to expose your pitchers to a risk factor? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I think especially when, every sort of professional organization is doing everything they can right now through implementing policy to protect the professional athletes that they serve. And you look at player unions and player associations and the power of their voice and their vote, it blows my mind that sometimes what can be presented to them is counter to their actual well-being or longevity for the sake of trying to increase exposure of the game that they play for an increased revenue or an increased sort of viewership. And I get the understanding from a business economical model, but you need the best players on the field. And when you're having a pitching duel or you're having a great played game, that's going to turn eyeballs to the television or get people in the seats more so than shaving 3 or 4 minutes off the clock to try to get one more commercial in.
Well, that's exactly it, right? They're not talking about reducing commercial breaks or, finding ways to minimize the amount of advertisements. It ultimately comes down to money and trying to make more money. And, I don't know. It doesn't necessarily seem like the best decisions are always made when it comes to this argument. That being said, maybe, I know in the SEC conference, the way their pitch clock works is it's only when there's nobody on base. So maybe it won't have as big of an influence, but I can't see that these pitchers or these decisions being made at the highest level are being made with equal weighting to all different sides of the table. It seems like the only weighting they care about is this a possible way for us to make more money for the game?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a good point too, because this listening audience may be familiar with the day-to-day sort of demands of what a pitcher might go through, and maybe they aren't. I mean, again, this is a wide-ranging conversation that sort of distills intangibles of what make people successful in all various different professional pursuits. But I think this would be a great segue, at least for me, for you as well, to share that, like, you are the host of a podcast called Day Games, which interviews, and it seems so far and into this season that it surrounds itself with baseball. So if any of this, my listening audience, is interested in sort of what you're talking about already, please, I highly suggest go on iTunes, go to this blog, and I'll link it into the show notes as well to Day Games, because for me, being 4 episodes in, I find it riveting, and certainly with working with baseball and softball and throwing athletes, there's a lot that I can take as a coach, as a practitioner, from the materials that you've been sharing. So I just wanted to say thank you and kind of plug your show as well.
Thanks. Because,
again, I think you're doing great work. You're great work with the show as well. I'd be curious. Now we've talked. We've geeked out a little bit, and that's by purpose of the show. But before I go into the next line, because I have to say this, because I will regret if I don't. In 2000, this is my attempt of at least telling someone else this story outside of my brother. But in 2010, I had an idea that this was at the sort of the boom, and certainly in Australia and overseas, they've been equipping accelerometers on athletes for many, many years before we started to gravitate to using that in the States. But I thought, why hasn't anybody ever affixed this to around the elbow, around the shoulder? And I was like, if I could develop a sleeve that had accelerometers and market it to baseball, that would be $1 billion idea. But obviously, right? Like, the difference between $1 million idea and $1 million is actually the execution of it, which is me.
That is a big one. That is a big one. Yeah.
I was like, okay, great idea. Don't know anything to do with it. I don't know how to proceed with it, but damn, that would be a great idea. So I'm glad that there are companies that are doing this. And you're the second person that's heard that story, that idea. That at least. I feel good that someone's making a profitable business off doing that. How did you was there anybody in your life, and maybe it was during undergrad, during your grad work or doctoral work, I mean, how did you mentor a person that pushed you in this? I mean, to study what you do and pursue certainly a PhD route for it. Any significant influencers or mentors in your life?
Yeah, so my supervisors for all my degrees, Dr. Dave Andrews was my master's supervisor, Dr. Jim Potvin was my supervisor for my doctoral studies, and Dr. Peter Keir supervised me during my postdoctoral fellowship. All 3 of those guys were great scientists. They've done some incredible work in their careers, but ultimately what attracted me to work with all of them was how they had a great interest in the world outside of their own research careers. So Dr. Andrews was a great photographer and an awesome family man. He was a great slow pitch player, and he was always had a great sense of humor. Dr. Potvin and I, we got along great talking about music and football. He is probably one of the smartest people that I've ever met in my life. It's intimidatingly intelligent, but we always got along because we just had all these shared interests in things that weren't necessarily just the science, but that made our relationship that much better so that we could have a really good scientific relationship. And then Dr. Keir, he was a he's a good hockey goalie, great sense of humor, and just really a lot of fun to work with. So all three of them had the main attraction of these are great people. They're fun people to be around, and they're the type of people that you want to spend those long hours with, because it's not always a smooth road when you're doing those types of studies. So you need to have some sort of a human connection, not just a research and academic connection with those guys.
Man, yeah, I think some of the most significant mentors in my life has shared that dual approach of being completely committed to your professional pursuits, whatever they might be, the thing that's passionate or drives you, but also to respect the other half of it, and that's the life and the disconnect from it. And because sometimes passion can be a double-edged sword. And like for me, especially in the coaching industry, I see way too many really, really high-level successful coaches that ultimately pursue that, but at the sake of it, lose friends and lose family and lose loved ones and lose kind of a sense of identity outside of their own sort of professional pursuits. So, I feel also pretty fortunate that I had very early mentors that also shared that same sort of resonating experience of, like pursue what you love, but also, have the humility and have the ability to disconnect from it, and which I think is lost.
And when you do have those passions, you know what, they bring everything together. This baseball thing, it did come about at a point in my life where I was definitely experiencing a lot of burnout and just the pressure of being in a postdoc and constantly searching for faculty positions. And I knew in my downtime it was difficult for me to turn it off completely. So I channeled it into something that was constructive. And like in those times where it was a hard time sleeping, or you're doubting whether or not this was the right career move, it was something that would be productive, keep me moving forward. And a lot of the ideas that I had in the baseball world, I've actually applied back to the ergonomics world, and vice versa. So they really don't operate independently of each other. And it's the same with those mentors of mine. A lot of the things that they did in their spare time, those fueled some of their passions for their research projects. And you can't view your hobbies as being something that takes away from your professional life. It's something that complements it. It keeps you sane. It keeps you, in touch with the rest of the world that's outside of your lab. And those are really important things.
Yeah, no doubt. I think having that sort of approach, they only make each other stronger. Like for me, and I said this on maybe a similar show, but I always try to tell my staff members here that the very best advice I can give them is to be where their feet are, and if they're in the weight room or they're in our training environment, to be fully committed here, and then when they're back at home, to be fully committed with their families and their loved ones. And I think it fuels both of them, because like obviously when you give your best at your professional pursuits, you should want to go home and recharge with your family. And after fully recharging with your family or your other sort of hobbies and other pursuits, you should be fully committed to come back in and do the job that you certainly love and you pursue. I don't know. I know this is a wide-ranging conversation, but I'd love to kind of dive back into because, again, I think you're the first guest that I have that is so deeply involved in analytics and statistics and looking at muscular fatigue. And, like my purpose and what I've really tried to drive here has been about workload monitoring and prevention of injuries. But, there was at the SSAC this year, they spoke about talent acquisition, and both a talent ID and acquisition, as, the analogy they used was buying a Ferrari, and then wanting to emphasize that if you're going to invest in a car of that caliber, you probably want to make sure that you're fueling it with premium gasoline and that you want to take care of it. And that's through analytics and through smart quality training. Maybe being separate from the training piece, what is it that analytics right now offers to all sports that sports should start to apply or look into as their organization and their sport program grows?
It's at the end of the day, it's objectivity. It's not you see a lot of stupid movies like Trouble with the Curve and stuff like that that are like, oh, analytics are the devil. They're taking away the old school scouts. I think I went into a long tangent with this development of a metric to say which pitcher in baseball has the best stuff. That's not meant to be like, oh, let's get rid of the influence of scouts. It's meant to like objectively state like, okay, you were right. He does have really good stuff. Analytics should be used in place to support and solidify what scouts are saying, what coaches are seeing. It should be evidence that's usable by coaches to help measure performance and evaluate players. Numbers are your friend, and I think what you're seeing a lot now in sports is the people that are really against them are the ones that are falling by the wayside, and they can get intimidated by them. And I know there's been points in my career where like the math in that can get pretty intimidating, but you have to embrace it and realize it's not that complicated at the end of the day. And if it's a metric worth using, typically it is relatively easy to understand if you put in the time to understand it. So analytics in the sporting realm is meant to be a great complement for coaches and scouts to help them do their jobs at a higher level.
And that's, I completely agree with you. And I think that sometimes it's fearful for practitioners, coaches, positions to think that it's going to replace their position. And it's really meant to complement and actually help them do their jobs better and to give them the objective sort of feedback that what they're seeing and what they're perceiving is not just a bias, but rather that it's honing their coach's eye or their recruiting eye and solidifying what their subjective opinions are of an athlete or of a person or whatever against objective data. And I think that's fascinating to me, especially when, you have people like Elon Musk talk about AI and robots replacing jobs. I think it's reassuring to hear that, your analytic department in your MLB club is not at an adverse of the front office trying to take recruiting and scouting positions away.
Yeah, and it's not even like I don't think it should even be viewed as something that's threatening to the players. Like the players who embrace it, I think they just put themselves in a better position. I mean, there's always like paralysis by analysis that you have to be careful with, but really they can be used by anyone involved in sport to just kind of solidify what they're seeing out there.
Yeah, and on top of that, to kind of bridge, like we see it so much in the NBA with the Whoop bands and sort of Adam Silver's sort of ban on wearable technology within the NBA games, and there's been a number of players that sort of purposely worn devices to monitor their own health. And again, I can't speak for any of the people, but as an athlete, certainly as a coach. Furthermore, I use that information in their very best decisions to affect their training load and their practice load and to help shape our practice structures. And I think, ultimately, I know it may seem invasive to an athlete to wear a monitoring device that really objectifies all their game and positional movements. But the way I look at it is that it's in the athlete's health best interests to use the information objectively rather than having a coach subjectively just predispose you to whatever a predisposed practice plan was or a pitch count was, especially when, pitch velocity or the pitch velocity or anything like that affects UCLs differently than a number of other sort of metrics. So I'd love to get a couple opinions from you as you sort of continue to go down this rabbit hole a little bit. But where do you think that sports on a larger scale will start to grow more of their analytic departments? Do you think that we'll start to see game time? And again, you're on the front lines, and most of my job and most of my day-to-day interactions are with athletes on the floor in the training environment. So I don't necessarily get to see behind the curtain like you do. But do you start to think that we are close to seeing real-time information or analytics being used to affect real-time game decisions on the coaching or on the sidelines, on the coach's box, wherever that coach might be?
I think that's a challenging proposition to look at, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I know like the Motus stuff was not available to the coaches in the dugouts, from what I understood. So right now, I think there's a blockade on that, but realistically, I guess it starts to come down to the whole analysis and paralysis thing. It would obviously be helpful. Like if there was some sort of great device that was out there that did a really good job of saying, oh, this is somebody who's at risk of injury if they keep going for another 5 minutes, and some light flashed on your bench. But I'm not sure if that's the way they work at this point in time. It would be beneficial for sure to have access to these analytics. And I think about it, as a baseball player, if you could, get access to what your hit speed was after you hit, and, Motus, their device can actually be attached to your batting glove too, and it can give you measures of swing speed and launch angle, and that those things would just help the athlete and the coaches. So hopefully that is the direction that they are going.
And one of the things too, on top of that I very much know what I know and know what I don't. So I'm not going to even pretend to try to go down this route. But someone with your experience, I'd love to hear what your opinions are of the industry and where we're going in this. But it seemed like so far a big theme of the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference is AI, machine learning, predictive analytics. How close is it to are we, I guess, from maybe removing the human element of analytics and allowing, a machine-based learning or AI to really start to make some of these predictable decision-making decisions, I guess, in these human sort of behaviors or human sort of movements?
I don't think we're that close to it. The nice thing about those machine learning algorithms is that they just get your answer a lot faster than you did in the past. But really, you still need a person to interpret things at the end of the day and to determine whether or not that information is useful to you. It's nice to try and paint all pictures with the same, brushstroke, but realistically, there's a lot of different factors that go into determining, is somebody at injury risk, and I don't think you can get all of that from the data that is currently available, and as a result, you can't really get that information into your machine learning algorithms. So it's really back to like the original concept of computers. If you have garbage going in, you get garbage coming out, and I think we still have to work on a lot of those inputs. Just a quick story, just in like our ergonomics field, there was a great paper done by an author named Birchbox back in the 90s, and he looked at all the different risk factors for injury in a big I was actually at Boeing, and they saw people lifting things that were really heavy. They were at a risk of injury, but almost double that risk factor was psychosocial things, which were not currently being measured. And another great one done at Ohio State, a study looked at how your lifting kinematics and kinetics changed if you were in a stressful versus a non-stressful environment. So that gets thrown into the mix as well. So it's really challenging to just say that one computer algorithm or one machine learning approach can answer all the questions. And my general experience with this so far is just interacting with the people on pitching Twitter and seeing, where their arguments and their discussions take them. And it's kind of funny because you have all these different camps where it's like velocity is the most important thing and command's the most important thing, and never the two shall meet. Well, realistically, it's a blend of those. And then at the same time, there's people that are saying it's velocity that's the only predictor of injury. And then other people are saying it's the mechanics that are the only thing that matter when getting hurt. And then you totally ignore the fact that if you have perfect mechanics, but you do it a million times, you're still going to get hurt. So it seems like right now, the current state of things is that people tend to pick their camp, and it's viewed as, oh, we really shouldn't be crossing over. When realistically, what we need is a lot of people working together from different disciplines and trying to tie all these problems together by looking at them through different lenses.
And I think that's really, from a professional pursuit, one of the things I've tried to do is to live on the fringe and live on the edge and realize how so similar a lot of these camps are, and try to attempt to bridge different groups of people together to answer a common problem that we all have, right? Like, regardless of what camp that you're in, I think all of them would say that player health and preventing injuries from occurring is what they're trying to do at the end of the day. And whether it is velocity or command or control or whatever, we see the similar battle within physical preparation as far as the modalities and the tools that we use to optimally prepare athletes. We see the same thing from a sports science standpoint, whether what metric from Catapult or whatever sort of workload monitoring tool or technology you want to use. Is it top end speed? Is it sprints? Is it velocity? Is it total distance? Is it IMAs, rapid accelerations, decelerations? But ultimately, I don't think it can be just one, like you said. I think we have to take a 30,000 foot view and realize that with human behavior and human people, that it's not going to typically be just one singular metric to predict or to assess whether an athlete's at a higher rate of injury. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I would. It's totally true. It's like you have to take the 30,000 view, and then also like the 6-foot view of the person themselves, and realize that there's so much interpersonal difference between athletes. One of the pieces I wrote on my blog was talking about how if you look at a football player, you can get a pretty decent idea as to what position they play just from seeing their body type. But then you have like Chris Sale plays the same position as Bartolo Colon, who plays the same position as Marcus Stroman. And those are three extremely different body types, but they all do the same job. And they all have different risks of injury, and they all have different ways of performing the same job, but they do it in very different ways. So there are general trends that we can identify from research. We can say, like, this is a risk factor, this is a risk factor. But when you're applying it to the person by person level, you really do have to account for those interpersonal differences.
Yeah.
And that's what makes people unique, and what makes somebody a star and somebody else not able to perform at a high level.
And I think that was something similar that was presented at the Seattle Sounders Sports Science Weekend last year, was just asking their sports scientists and people that are, in charge of sort of workload monitoring and a number of other facets to start to understand the human aspect of the information and the data that they're collecting. And one of the central themes was literally just being present and having, conversations and developing a rapport with the athletes that they're working with, to understand that they're not just there as subjects and they're not just there as data scientists, but they're trying to bridge the gap between them, because without context of where those numbers are deriving, it's hard to get an understanding of truly what those numbers actually mean when you're looking just at a computer or at MATLAB, or you're pulling the information or scraping it from somewhere. I think context is something that's sorely missed.
Oh, without a doubt. And like, that's the point that I've reached, is like, I have now like worked heavily with baseball data for like a year and a half, and it's been purely with pitch FX databases and pulling things off the internet. And I've definitely hit my tipping point where it's like, okay, that was fun. I need to get on the ground and talk to people, because that was fun. I've never been able to access a database of that size before, but where I have the most fun doing research is when I'm actually talking to people. So actually today is the first time I'm going to work with a team to get my feet on the ground and understand what it is that actually pitching coaches want to help answer their questions. Because really, if they've got to know how to ask the right questions of us researchers for us to get them the right answers. But if we're not trying to figure out what questions they're asking, then we're kind of lost.
Yeah, that's the maybe the second piece of advice I try to tell our staff here is that when they're going to meet and work with the coach for the first time, that my first recommendation for them is to try to ask that coach, what are the questions that they've always had that they wish they could have an answer for but don't have the time to do? And for that, a lot of the times it starts to spur this conversation of like, I've always kind of wondered X and I wish I could figure that out. Or I've always thought that Y or Z leads us to this destination, but man, I'm just too busy to figure it out. I wish I had that answer. And that's a good sort of bridge for applied sports scientists to start to draw them in breadcrumb by breadcrumb of starting to use information in their daily coaching interactions and decisions. So I'd be curious, I would love to touch base as you start this adventure, this journey down this pathway of understanding what, and this is probably different from every organization to organization, but what a pitching coach generally wants, or what are the questions that plagues them that they never have the time? Do you have any sort of predictions if you were to make a hypothesis about, and tough, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but tough, what the general thoughts that you might have that they, have? I'm playing Inception a little bit, but.
Yeah, I really just think like ultimately pitching coaches are trying to figure out, how can my guys get hitters out? And how can I keep them healthy doing it? And those are the big overarching questions that I think anyone who works in the field probably has. And then, you essentially have two different streams where you can get finer and finer questions. How do we generate spin on a ball? How do we get more break? How do we improve velocity while making players stay healthy and giving them more endurance? Those are all the big questions that I keep seeing. And it's a totally different animal up here in Canada. We have a lot of kids that are 15, 16, and their big focus is hockey because it's Canada. So we see different types of athletes in baseball here than you would in some of the southern states. So that I couldn't tell you what specific questions I'm going to get once I head out there. But I hope I get a lot of them so that it gives me a lot of room to work with and to hopefully answer those at the best level I can.
Yeah, I hear this and been a part of this in some capacities, is that the worst feeling you can have is when you go in there and you're like, hey coach, I'm ready to do everything. I'm, this is what I'm hoping for. What questions can I, provide some answers for? I'd love to provide some data for you. And they're like, we're good. Like, oh, well, where do I start then?
Yeah. It seems like these guys are really excited to have some of my input, but man, I'm just so excited to get back on fields again, because I actually like kind of bringing it full circle. When I was in grade 9, I started as the student trainer for the football team at the high school I was at, and they sent me to the university to learn how to tape ankles and do hamstring wraps and get my first responder certification. And I did that all through high school. And then through undergrad, I was one of the student trainers for the football team at the University of Windsor and made some of the best friends of my life there. And then I went into a different field altogether. So totally different. But now, this is kind of coming back completely full circle, bringing my passions with the athletic therapy world together with my biomechanics and ergonomics world, and then channeling them towards working in baseball. So it's super exciting.
I love that journey where, like you divert off your pathway and then you go down a trail a little bit, and then you find your way that it forks back into what is otherwise your calling or your essential purpose. And I find that, I don't know, maybe just cognitively rewarding for me when I see and hear stories like that. So that gets me pumped up to hear that you're making that completion of that circle. I'd love to, for a moment, especially with your experience, I'd love to know what you think the biggest mistakes are right now in analytics and statistics and using data informed or objective data driven analysis into making decision makings. What are the biggest maybe myths and mistakes and the biggest wastes of times that you see other people or the general perception has when they're thinking about these?
I think reductionism is probably the biggest mistake that a lot of people make, and that just means that they see one thing that tweaks their interest, and then they say that's the only thing that matters, and they put their blinders on to the rest of the world. There's just no way that we can answer these questions at this point in time by blinding ourselves to other possible answers or other possible opinions, because if that was the case, we would have solved all these problems a long time ago.
Yeah.
That's an absolutely huge one. I think from the analytics side, it's forgetting that there's human beings on the end effector of what you're looking at. So it's great to pull in a database of 7 million data points with pitch FX data and think that means who's the best pitcher in the world without knowing that there's a beating heart and a bunch of muscles and tendons and bones and personality on the other end. It's the ongoing battle that you always see on social media is the old school guys who talk about intangibles and the new school guys saying, well, let's measure everything, and never the two shall meet. Well, realistically, things are only subjective until they can get measured, and then they become objective. So it's just a matter of finding the right tool to measure those things.
Yeah, no doubt. When you think about this, and I'll try to think of maybe a better segue, but with your experience and now coming maybe full circle and stepping back into a pen or back into on the baseball field, and just thinking of maybe a younger version of yourself, right? Because it's a different world that we're living in now, especially I just think of the tools, like professional grade tools. For me, as I'm going through adolescence in the 90s, I don't know if I had access to MATLAB or some of these pro grade sort of tools, or if I could go on GitHub and scrape data off of it back then, right? Hell, I had AOL little floppy disks. It was a big deal for me to log on and you've got mail for me.
And then your mom would connect to the internet.
Yeah, right. Get off the phone.
Ah, damn.
Yeah, exactly. So that access to otherwise professional grade tools and information that a 13-year-old kid could do in their basement in their free time, right? So I'm painting the picture because here I am playing Ultima Online as a 13-year-old kid on dial-up, 56K internet, wasting time, But now we have STEM, we have these miniature scientists and technology enthusiasts, literally engineering, math, people that are doing this in their free time, and they're 13 years old and they're wondering, they're watching their heroes or watching the Chicago Cubs, whoever it might be, literally win the World Series, and we're starting to blend the two together.
Yeah.
What would be your advice for this 13, 14, 15 or whatever age you want to pin to it, that as they're listening to this or someone's listening to this and they're like, man, like Mike is doing exactly what I want to do. Like he's in the numbers, he's on the field, he's starting to work with pitching coaches, that he's making an influence. What would be that advice that you would share to them?
Just get started. A lot of people get lost in the nuances of, what it takes to just get moving in that direction. But man, there's so many free training courses to teach people how to work with data and how to do some basic programming. That if you want to go down that road, go into it. But even just websites like Fangraphs has access to so much data. And I've seen people online, 16, 17 that are writing little blog posts about, their favorite players. And that's awesome to see that people are learning how to make graphs and how, they're learning to make a difference in that world. And there's no reason why you can't at a young age get into that sort of thing. In all honesty, I think like the best advice you can give somebody who's younger and looking to get into the field is just to tell them if you think it's fun, then do it. Because like ultimately you've got to have fun doing this, because a lot of people, and myself not included, because I don't pay my bills working in sport. But it's not a great pay. It's tough, long hours, like I'm sure you deal with all the time, Adam. And you've got to be in it for the right reasons. And those right reasons are you truly love doing it.
Yeah, I think when you can mix a professional pursuit with that passion, like I said earlier, it can be a double-edged sword. But for me, I show up every day and I work with student athletes, and it doesn't feel like work at all. And and I say this, and nearly every recruit I talk to or athlete probably heard it from me, but like if they stop paying me, I would probably still show up to work next day because I love doing what I do, and that's a part of finding something that is meaningful, passion driven, and smart.
Oh, without a doubt, that means the world to everybody.
I wanna be respectful for your time, and I don't wanna feel like I'm preventing you from doing the otherwise work that we all probably have on a weekend, whether that's R&R or if that's actually like diving deep into databases or anything else. But I'd love to get maybe just a couple more things as we kind of get to this. But first of all, what would be if you could request something from this audience? Anything that, like if they could take away and apply one thing actionable from your experiences, from your history, from the things that's led you to the success that you've had or failures that you've made and that you would wish that they could jump over or circumvent, what would be that request?
I'd say the reaching out to that pitching Twitter community, if they're listening to it, is find out whatever you believe the absolute most about how pitchers get people out, and now go read 3-4 posts or papers on the exact opposite viewpoint and see how close to the other side they actually are. Because a lot of what people are reading, a lot of what people are doing, they're not so far apart. And a lot of the times what ends up happening is that they start fighting over something, and then if they were to actually take a step back, they're all saying the same thing. So spend time reading the opposite viewpoint is probably the biggest piece of advice that I can give you.
And I think that I hope that as you're saying that, and certainly about pitching and pitching mechanics, but I would hope that extends so much further than just pitching, right? Like in almost every other discipline, please read the opposite viewpoint, because I think that just provides so much humility and understanding of where the opposition, or whatever, if we want to call that the opposition, but the counterpoint is. And I think that brings us so much closer to a central, agreeable position and stance. And I think that's good for everybody.
Yeah, it can be uncomfortable, but you need to understand where the other side is coming from to better understand your own side, I think.
In the last couple years of your professional life, is there anything to bridge that sort of request? Is there anything that you've sort of flipped on, like that you maybe approached and thought, you know what, I'm pretty close to this end of the spectrum, that after some analysis, you're like, you know what, they might have had it better. They might have had a better approach, or I'm more on the other end of it. Is there anything come to mind that you maybe made a switch or a decision to go the other way?
I wouldn't say there's anything that has been like anything that cut and dry. I would say like the biggest change that I've had in recent memory is going from the paradigm that the only research that's valuable is peer-reviewed, published research, and that it's great to have these social media accounts and blogs, but realistically those should just be used to fuel you towards doing actual solid science that gets published. I think there's a lot of people out there that do really good science and publish it online. And I think a lot of those things can be just as important, if not more important, than some of the peer-reviewed research that's out there. That being said, peer-reviewed research, particularly in biomechanics and ergonomics, is extremely important because going through that peer review process really does make your work that much better because it's being vetted by some of the most discerning eyes in the field. You have to do that. But at the same time, I don't think every single piece of work that you put up has to get published through that realm because it takes forever. There's whole ethical concerns with the publishing industry and how much money they make off the backs of free labor in academics. But yeah, publishing in journals at one point in time in my mind was the only way to convey your message. But I've learned, in the last year and a half, just how important it is to try and get your message out there in other ways, be it through the internet and blog posts, or be it through podcasts like Day Games, or even these live shows like Pitch Talks that I've been really lucky to be a part of in Ontario here.
I have my brother lives out in Silicon Valley, and out there, I mean, obviously the overwhelming sort of consensus is that they're sort of living in this sort of technology bubble, and that tech bubble at any point in time may pop. And as a result, many jobs could certainly go. And I also kind of think that we're at that point from an academia standpoint or a peer review or a scholarly journal standpoint that we might be at a bubble there. And I'm curious what the next sort of disruptor of that industry potentially could be. But I completely agree with you. I think that there's, a need for validated scholarly research that's gone through the peer review process, but that shouldn't also discount the work that applied sports scientists or applied positions are doing, as long as it's in a controlled manner and in that realm. But I don't think that they're necessarily so mutually exclusive. So man, what a great insight from you. Hey, I want to do this as well. I would love I'd love for you to, if someone was listening this and they wanted to reach out to you, or they wanted to, I know I mentioned your website a couple of different times, or wanted to reach out to your podcast and subscribe to it on iTunes or elsewhere, where can this listening audience find your materials? What's the best way they can reach you?
Probably through Twitter at Dr. Mike Sonne, so DrMikesonne, or my website, mikesonne.ca. Both are good places to get in contact with me, and I've got links to the pod up on both there.
Oh, wonderful, man. Doctor, I appreciate, Mike, I appreciate you coming on to our show. This whole idea of the Decoding Excellence Show is just to provide a sort of view, a sneak behind the curtain, and to understand what makes you tick, and to try to provide maybe a narrative, some stories that allows for the audience to get a better understanding of what people in this industry, working within sports and working within athletics, go through their daily lives and how they got to the positions that they got in. And again, I just can't thank you enough for the experiences and the wisdom that you shared as we've, spent a little time and geeked out over some information. And I certainly, like I said, this is a way for me to scratch my own itch. And I appreciate your time, sir, coming on. And I look forward so much to continuing this conversation here in the future.
Definitely, Adam. We'll have to touch base again in a year once I've had some time working with real people again, and we can go from, I don't know, maybe decoding even more excellence at that point in time.
Hey, I appreciate it so much. You, sir, have a great rest of your day. Appreciate it. I want to thank today's guest, Dr. Mike Sonne, for coming on to the Decoding Excellence Show and discussing everything baseball mechanics, pitching, muscular fatigue, and analytics, Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. I think this is a wide-ranging conversation that you should be able to take away just how important analytics and statistics are in the modern-day era of sports. I can't thank Dr. Mike Sonne enough for participating to do this show. And like always, if you've taken anything away from the show, if it resonates with you, if it's made you think about doing something a little bit different in your high-performance practice, please go onto iTunes, give us a review, an honest review. If there's things that we can continue to improve on the show, please let me know. I would love to make this show even better for you. The purpose of this show was always to understand and decode excellence. What makes a great coach? What makes a great program? The tools, the tactics, the techniques, the intangibles that go into creating a highly successful program or becoming a master coach and practitioner. Like always, if you enjoyed this, please share it on your social media of choice. And until next time, thank you for tuning in to the Decoding Excellence Show.